Chapter 2.
It was late October when I arrived in that dusty desert Arizona town. The sun had set moments before and the temperature was dropping fast. Not like that's unusual in the desert. My ride had dropped me off a few blocks from a park where they claimed I could stay the night. I hoped they were right, as the area didn't seem to be a good one. But then again, when did I ever end up in a nice neighborhood anymore? Homeless people weren't exactly welcome in places where Mercedes were parked, where the McMansions were, where the ladies who lunched lived. My world had gotten grittier the longer I'd been on the streets, but like a lobster in a slowly heating pot, I don't think I noticed how bad it had become most of the time. It simply was my life now. Walking the couple of short blocks, I noticed how few people were out on this nice night. Sweating a little despite the growing chill, I passed run-down and abandoned commercial buildings. You know that feeling like you're being watched? Not likely you are, but your spine tingles anyway? That night, I was sure someone was following my every move. Being ambushed in the dark was one of my biggest fears. What would they do when they realized I had no money to steal? I never wanted to find out. I wished I'd stopped at a different town earlier in the day when it was still light out, but I'd so wanted to be as far south as possible. When I started out that morning, I was determined that today was going to be my last day of traveling this year. I've been hitching rides for almost a month to land somewhere I could make a nice warm winter home. Enough traveling for a while. It was time for this snowbird to find a place to land and finally rest. So this town was it, almost to Mexico, but now it was dark. Not a way to start life in a new town. As I entered the small city park, I saw several still forms huddled around. Some were under blankets, while others were only under several layers of clothing.
Thus I knew my ride had been correct with their information. My tension flowed out of me as I slowly unclenched my hands that I now realized I'd balled into fists. Not like I could have fought off an attacker with a 20-pound pack on my back.
Not with me weighing slightly over 100 pounds soaking wet. But in this park all was secure. My brethren homeless were here, so everything was fine. There's safety in numbers. Some were on benches, some on the grass, but each had found a comfortable place for the night, as comfortable as one could be sleeping in a park at any rate. This was their home and mine also, for at least this one evening. I knew that in the morning they could guide me around and help me get the lay of the land from a homeless perspective, where a soup kitchen was, the cheapest laundry mats, the best convenience store bathrooms, maybe a place of free clothes, maybe a shelter, and what was most important, where to avoid. There were places where homeless people would always be kicked out. You'd be yelled at and told in no uncertain terms that you were trash.
No point in being shamed if you could help it. There's no printed tourist map with information like that.
You gotta seek it out from those who live on the streets and understand the needs of the homeless.
Because we walk in the same shoes, so to speak, we can help each other.
Some will, some won't.
But it never hurt to ask.
Sooner or later, someone will give you the info that was needed. As I found a place to sit under a tree, I settled in to watch the stars and the city lights. As they twinkled in some kind of insane competing light show, I began to cry. Maybe it was because it was beautiful, or maybe it was one of those days. Who knows? You ever feel like that? Where everything makes you sad? Where you've got to cry even if for no reason at all? I have days like that a lot. I try to hide it. People think I'm crazy enough because I'm homeless. I'm not crazy. Well, I don't think I am. Confused, sad, sure that I'm not worth much. Those things are true. But crazy? No, not so much. Without warning, someone was shaking me. Nice and slow, I opened my eyes, crusted from the salt of my tears. Seeing a rather large black cop dressed in a blue uniform standing over me, I almost started to cry again. Hadn't even realized I'd fallen asleep, still propped up against that tree, half slumped over my pack. My neck and back were screaming in protest over the awkward position I'd slept in, but my body should be used to it by now.
I slept in strange places and positions all the time. Beds were a luxury, not a necessity. Birds were chirping their tunes. Cars were buzzing by in the nearby street.
Life was going on as usual for the rest of the world. "Miss, you can't stay here," the cop said in a deep, firm voice. It was morning already, the sky turning pink at the edges, signifying that my wake-up call had arrived. You know, every so often a traditional alarm clock would be nice. The beep, beep, beep would almost be comforting. Sorry, I muttered as I rubbed the gunk from my eyes.
Gathering up my pack, I knew better than to argue with a cop. There wouldn't be time for my usual morning ritual cleanup.
Ick. I may be homeless, but I still have enough pride to try to stay clean, which, I might add, isn't the easiest thing to do in my present situation. Unable to help the others, I stood and watched. Everyone was being awakened by the small band of cops wandering the park. I wondered what the problem was. After all, we'd been there all night. Surely there must have been a better use of these officers' time than to round us up.
It wasn't a crime to be homeless.
Nor was it a crime to beg for money, but I knew most people wished both were. Good grief, how many times have I heard someone ask a policeman to arrest someone for being homeless? Now, if that homeless person was drunk, that's an entirely different problem altogether. But most of the men in the park with me that morning didn't have open containers. Yet here we all were, being rousted without a viable reason. How would you feel if a cop entered your home and did this to you? Helpless, hopeless, ashamed, confused? That's what I felt at that moment. They do this every morning. Turning, I saw the speaker, a weather-beaten, tall, lanky man whose face looked like worn leather. His hair was such a pale blonde it was almost white. He wore tattered brown shorts and a black t-shirt. His torn sneakers showed his toes sticking out, sockless. He was holding a small satchel that didn't close, and his belongings were trying to escape out the top. He could have been anywhere from 20 to 100 years old. I was leaning towards 100 because he smelled like death warmed over. Why, I asked, completely bewildered. I'd slept in so many parks that I don't think I could remember half of them, and this hadn't happened before. We're hard to see at night, but during the day we're real obvious, and that's not the kind of landscaping they want. As he said this, his mouth widened into a smile. The lines on his face melted, fading away most of the years of hard living he'd done. He rolled a fat cigarette between his stained fingers and lit it. You can come with us. We go down to the kitchen and talk till lunch. All right, I said. It was always good to know that there would be at least one meal on any given day. There had been so many days over the years where there wasn't a meal at all, either for myself or the other homeless I so often found myself surrounded by.
Despite my many attempts at being alone, I never seemed to be.
Shouldering my pack, I followed the motley bunch who were slow to gather their belongings and leave. I was the only woman in the group of about 30 people. Most were resigned to their fate of being driven out so early in the morning, yet a few pushed against the officers who were only doing their jobs as we left the park. Old, young, fat, skinny, drunk, sober, almost clean, crusty, dirty, white, brown, black, red, yellow. You name it, it was in that bunch of men rousted from that park. If you looked, that was usually the case in a crowd of homeless people, but no one ever thinks to give a closer look. Everyone thinks we're all the same, but nothing could be further from the truth. Homeless people are like any other social group, mixed. I once looked down on the homeless people from my third-floor office and didn't want to know anything about them. I kept thinking they were all the same, drunk, mentally ill, minorities. I now know the truth. Anyone can end up here for any reason. The stories I had heard would have broken my heart if I still had one, if I ever had one. No, my reason for being in this crowd was one of the more stupid ones, if not the stupidest, but no one would ever know my story. It was locked in my memory vault forever. Unusual to see a fresh face in the crowd, especially female. Where do you drift in from? The stranger asked, blowing smoke high in the air above my head. Here and there, I answered, moving a little further from him. Smoke makes me cough, and I didn't want to seem rude by suddenly breaking into a bout of hacking up a lung. Been out here a while and ain't found a way out yet. Be forewarned, there is none. Once you're out here, you can't go back. He pointed his thumb over his shoulder as he said this, like normal was so far away, could only be hinted at. He was more than likely right in that. What was normal anyways? I have a master's degree.
I could get a job any time I want.
I bit back at him, huffing as I glared at him. What right did he have to question my choices? It was evident that his choices weren't any better than mine. He was out here living on the street the same as me. From the looks of him, there was no way that this was a one-time thing for him, any more than it was for me. As if anyone would take you with years of blank space on your resume, he chuckled, then broke into the raspy cough of a lifelong smoker. Oh, I didn't want to look at him, and I didn't want him to see me. I switched my glare to my feet and walked with my head down. My battered hiking boots clomped on the pavement. It was as if they were sealing my old life into a coffin 6 feet underground. Darn him for reminding me that I was stuck with this choice I'd made. I switched my gaze to the houses around us. This was an impossible conversation to have. This guy had a one-track mind. Who said I wanted to stop living like I did anyway? At least for now, I need to be out here searching, looking, discovering. Being in one place wasn't going to solve anything. Not that moving around seemed to be solving anything either. But someday, somehow, I'd find what I was looking for. I had to believe that. It was the only thing keeping me going. How did that song put it? Oh, yeah. The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. That's it. I need to keep following the wind wherever it may blow. Who cared if I was beginning to look like a tumbleweed in addition to acting like one? How long you been out here? I asked in desperation, trying to turn the focus on him. Almost 20 years, he said with what sounded like pride. Well, he had a big blank space on his resume, much bigger than mine at that stage of my travels. At the corner of my eye, I could see his arm begin to rise. I followed it with my gaze.
Pointing to a small shack at the end of the street, he declared, "That's the kitchen." He dropped what was left of his cigarette and ground it beneath the heel of his battered shoe. As we walked from the park, I'd gotten a good look around the area. Calling it a neighborhood, not a garbage pile, would have been a stretch. The place consisted of many small houses crowded close together. There seemed to be some sort of contest to see who could let their home decay the fastest. Or maybe it was who had the most colorful or artistic display of junk. On those houses that had paint, the paint was peeling. Chunks were missing from those that were stucco. The houses were for the most part earth-toned colors.
My guess was that the original plan was to blend in with the desert landscape. However, that had failed in a spectacular fashion, thanks to what the residents had added. Many homes needed roof repairs. You could see where clay tiles or shingles were missing. The few porches were unusable because they were piled with junk. Not your typical junk, mind you, but broken furniture placed in almost artistic heaps. Small objects such as toys, toasters, and broken pottery were crammed in every free inch of space between table or chair legs. Almost every house had a hulk of a car in the front yard that was at least 30 years old. Broken down and rusted hunks of metal. Most were on blocks with kids playing in and around them. It was like they were the world's greatest jungle gyms. Since the park that we'd slept in had nothing for the kids to play on, I guess it made sense in a twisted, dangerous sort of way. There were refrigerators, washers, and other appliances in many yards. There were also plastic lawn decorations and ceramic Catholic saints, but no grass, only sand and dirt to run across. Every few houses there were tall, stately cactus, and these were standing like sentries over the whole place. Who or what they were guarding would be hard to say. Most houses had ropes attached to anything upright. Brightly colored laundry had already been hung for the day. The sheets and clothing were snapping in the breeze. Whack, whack, whack. I had no clue how they were going to stay clean for long, with children running between each piece, kicking up dust as they went, sun dancing on the sand as it was carried in the wind. Dogs were yapping. Some were chained to a stake in a particular yard, but most were just running free, chasing the children. Harsh smells of soap and cleaners mixed with the smells of breakfast being prepared. Spicy foods with the rich, tangy aromas of onions, sausages, and chili peppers. Smells so good you could taste them on the air. My mouth began to water, and I swallowed hard to keep from drooling, kicking myself that I didn't have anything to eat. Feeling angry when you have no right to be isn't a good thing. It's not your food. You didn't work for it. Get over it, Cindy. Ignore your hunger. None of the people who had given me a ride yesterday had been kind enough to also give me even a snack, much less a meal. That was all too often the case. Yet my stomach reminded me that it still had needs and didn't care if people were kind or not. The people I saw were Hispanic. Children of all ages were running everywhere, yards, alleys, streets. These kids were little more than naked since it was already quite hot. Even though the sun had burst over the horizon only moments ago, their skin shined with sweat. Their cute, chubby little faces would pop up in unexpected places. Then others would shout with glee at the surprise. The children's laughter echoed around the neighborhood. It bounced off the wall of each house and the junk in the yard. Laughter was everywhere at once. Such a pleasant sound mixed in with the usual harsher sounds of life in a city. The beep of a horn, the whir of a motor, the rumble of a truck. The whole place was a chaotic world of odors, noise, and color. At a chain-link fence my guide opened the gate to the kitchen yard.
Little did I know this would lead to the place that would contain my greatest few months ever. Funny how I waited to be homeless to have a few months that weren't quite so horrible, not quite so miserable. Not my childhood when I was being beaten up by my father and put down by my mother. Not college when the other students thought I was weird.
Not my marriage, when my husband thought I was cold and unfeeling. To be honest, my life had only been good when things were simple, and that was too much to ask for most of the time. Life isn't simple, it's complex and hard. We demand too much of ourselves and others. Circumstances dictate that we be placed in situations over which we have so little control. We allow ourselves to be concerned with what we want, not what we need. Simple is as rare as a day without pain and as pure as a heartfelt cry. But simple is good, and simple is what I need the most, but is the one thing that I can't seem to find easily. Maybe someday I'll find simple again, like what I found there at a tiny kitchen on the wrong side of town where most people wouldn't be willing to go. The yard was small for the purpose it served, earth hard packed from so many feet walking across it day in and day out. Unlike the others around it, it was clean and tidy. Milk and vegetable crates were being used as chairs and footstools by both old and young men. But not only those few from the park. I hadn't any idea where the rest of them came from. There must have been about 100 people milling about. Almost all the ground was being used by someone. Several people sat on the sidewalk in front of the house. Several more sat on cars parked along the street. The shack itself had recently been painted a bright pink, blue, and purple. Maybe someone's leftover paint? But it didn't quite hide the fact that the building was in desperate need of repair.
Yet the shack did stand out for being painted as a shiny beacon of newness in a sea of decay and despair. Somehow day-old doughnuts had arrived, so we retreated to breakfast.
That would seldom happen over the rest of my stay, but I didn't know it at the time. I only had a few cents rattling around in the pocket of my worn jeans, not enough to even buy a piece of penny candy. Just one look and you would know that this neighborhood wasn't a good location to find loose change on the street. If there ever was a penny to fall, all those kids would have been there to pick it up in 2 seconds flat. They needed the money as bad as any of the men already gathered here at the soup kitchen. Maybe more so, since they were impoverished by birth and not by their own choosing or making. Then again, maybe not, since they hadn't known anything different than gut-wrenching poverty. Why would they expect anything more than nothing? Would they even know that there was a better life out there somewhere? Not unless you took the time to tell them there was something more, something beyond the invisible wall around their world. Pulling a crate out of the stack by the door, I found a spot to sit and began to munch on a chocolate-covered
Donut.
I decided to introduce myself to the man who had led me to this haven, who was hovering nearby. By the way, name's Cindy. I'd shake your hand, but with the sugar factor involved.
He wiggled.
His powdered, sugar-covered fingers in the air, he grabbed another donut and a crate and sat down.
As well. You understand, I'm sure. I'm Sam. He turned to wave to a tall, skinny, long-haired, unkempt young man.
The newcomer wore cut-off jean shorts, a ratty t-shirt with the faded logo of some band, and sandals. Philip, come join us. Turning back to me, he explained, he runs the kitchen. This new person also pulled up a crate and grabbed a donut. So who's the new face? Philip asked, giving me a casual once-over. Cindy, pretty, isn't she? Sam replied. Won't last long in this environment. It's too harsh on the ladies, Philip said as he pointed to the sun with his chin. They laughed. I felt self-conscious.
I knew that I wasn't good-looking, but I wasn't entirely sure why they were laughing at me.
Then again, they could have been simply thinking how much uglier I could get. Leather looks good on a woman when it's hugging her curves, not when her skin has been dried into it by long exposure to the sun. How's the petition going? Sam asked. Not well. The neighbors don't agree that a soup kitchen is a vital community service. Everyone claims that you guys lower their property values. The city may shut us down if we can't get enough of the neighbors to sign the petition for the variance. It's stupid. We've been operating long enough that we should be grandfathered in. We shouldn't have to meet the zoning code simply because we need to update and expand. Philip frowned, licking the frosting off his fingers. Another thing you rarely see in soup kitchens, napkins. Sometimes you crave dignity even though you know you shouldn't. You want to scream until someone listens, but you don't. You quietly lick your fingers, wipe your hands on your dirty pants, and go on. The conversation between Sam and Philip was interesting.
The neighborhood didn't seem to have any value. The nicest property was the kitchen's, which wasn't saying much.
What in the world could the other residents have a problem with? Some of the children we'd seen here looked worse off than the homeless children I'd seen in my travels. My guess was that many of the meals served at the kitchen went to the neighbors. The homeless men now enjoying the donuts on this beautiful morning would eat too. That went without saying. Yet would you want to wake up to a trail of homeless bums walking up your street each morning? But then again, maybe the neighbors had no say because they didn't own the property they lived on. Another one was found dead this morning during wake-up call, Sam said as he grabbed his third donut. I was on my second, this time a cinnamon sugar one. I was wishing yet again that I could have had the much heartier breakfast that I'd smelled on the walk. Seemed like it must have been breakfast burritos or something similar. So much better than these hard donuts. All the sugar was making me feel a little bit nauseous on an empty stomach.
But food was food. I heard no one cares. The cops haul the body to the morgue, and tomorrow he'll be buried without even a marker.
Half the time I wonder if they even try to find the family, or the guy's real name for that matter. The faraway look in Philip's eyes as he said this seemed to show he cared, like each of these lives was precious to him. Foolish of him. I was sure he had a home to go to each night. There was no reason for him to be so concerned about a bunch of homeless guys. It was enough for him to be down here running this kitchen. No one would expect anything more from him. Enough business, Sam. Today's Saturday. Those college kids will be down. Ah, yes, Steve and his harem. Sam laughed, wiping his face free from donut crumbs with his hand. They're enough to brighten anyone's day.
Abruptly, Philip turned and seemed to truly notice me for the first time. "How about you come inside and help me a bit?" "Sure," I said as I gathered up my pack once again and followed him into the building. Unlike the outside, the inside was dingy, lit with dim, bare bulbs. The walls were painted an institutional green color, stained with goodness only knows what. I peeped into the kitchen area, and it appeared that the kitchen was twice the size it should have been. The space went well beyond the entryway, creating a vast cavern. My guess was that one of the walls had been knocked down, thus the kitchen was also one of the original bedrooms. There were several stoves and refrigerators, but only one small sink and no counter space. The building was cooler than outside, but by a small fraction, and humid enough for my dirty shirt to stick to my skin. The whole place reeked of rotting vegetables and celery. Without thinking, I wrinkled my nose in disgust. I was sure that I didn't smell much better, so then who was I to judge? Cindy, a meal is a meal. You've eaten out of garbage cans, for goodness sakes. Still, what would you have thought walking in there? You wouldn't have made it past the threshold before you turned and ran. Top ramen is as low as you'll go? Fine. Kind of with you on that one. "You can put your pack in the back room and wash up a bit in the bathroom," he said as he pointed to a door at the other end of the main room. Rather blunt, but I didn't care. I needed to use the toilet in the worst way. In the rush out of the park, there'd been no time for the niceties that normal people get when they wake up. What I wouldn't give sometimes for a day when I could lounge in bed and get up at my leisure, not having to rush to ensure that I'd get the basics of the day taken care of. It was sometimes tough for me to remember a time when going to a bathroom any time I wanted to wasn't a luxury. Now I was lucky to be able to use a bathroom half the time I needed one. Most of the time I had to make do with finding a semi-private spot behind a bush or trash can. You have no idea how hard that can be sometimes. When I came back out, I was put to work washing vegetables in the bathtub of all places. That had to be some kind of health code violation. Food prep in a smelly bathroom. Not like anyone was going to care. This place fed the people most tried to ignore on a daily basis. The vegetables weren't what you'd call garden fresh. Limp carrots, a ton of wimpy celery, a few onions with black spots, mushy potatoes with eyes all over. Typical soup kitchen fare, food thrown away by someone else. I started my task with a sigh, wondering yet again why people felt it was kind to give something worthless to people with no value. Sometimes I think it's better for us to go without than to be reminded of what our true worth in society is. Really, those of us out here on the streets know where we belong in the social hierarchy. Most of us know that most of you think pond scum is higher, but you're wrong. So very wrong. You see yourselves in us. That's why you're always looking down on us. I get it. It's a pretty quick slide to get where I'm at. "Hi, I'm Patty." Turning my head to look up from where I was sitting on the cold tile floor by the tub, I saw a short girl. She wore old gray sweats and a faded red t-shirt, grinning from ear to ear. Her long black hair was tied back in a ponytail. She wasn't much younger than me. "I was told you might need some help back here." She bounced on her toes, way too happy to be here. This wasn't a place to be cheerful unless you were homeless and hungry. Even then, that was debatable. "I'm almost finished," I said, not giving her more than a quick glance or two. She seemed to hesitate, biting her lower lip. It was almost as if she was searching her mind for some common ground to open a conversation with. "So, what's your name?" She started to gather up the clean vegetables from the bin I'd placed them in. Not that the bin was what you'd call clean. "Cindy." I tried to stare only at the vegetables. They were easier to concentrate on since they couldn't talk back. Feeling uncomfortable, I shifted my position. When was my last shower? Who was this college kid? She must have had plenty of money from somewhere to not have to work on weekends. Actually, we might have had more in common than she could have ever imagined. I was raised in a solid middle-class family, for what that was worth. Sure, my dad was a functioning alcoholic, but I, for the most part, had everything money could buy and nothing it couldn't. No love, no acceptance, no comfort of knowing someone was there for me no matter what. I wonder if she ever felt the same. Not likely. She seemed much too full of bliss to have skeletons and demons hiding in her closet. "Well, welcome, Cindy. I'm glad you're here." She patted my shoulder, and I recoiled at her touch. "You don't touch the unlovable. It might rub off and destroy you, too. You don't want to end up in my shoes. Trust me. I'm only here for lunch. I'm leaving town soon." Not exactly true. I was planning on finding a good camping spot to winter in, so no point in making any kind of attachments. Plus, getting to know people caused problems I didn't need. I'd learned that lesson the hard way. So many lessons learned, and I never seemed to learn them any way other than hard. "Sorry to hear that. Philip was hoping you'd stick around and help him." She smiled at me again. What was she talking about? Why would he want me? No one ever wanted me. "He never mentioned anything to me about that," I mumbled. "Well, he's still working out the details. He does this for all the women who show up at the kitchen. This town's not a safe place at night. None of us want to see any harm done that could be avoided." The confidence in Patty's voice was almost reassuring. "You must come here a lot to know so much about the way this program works." "Every Saturday since I started grad school 2 years ago." "Really," I said as I stood up and stretched. The vegetables were done, and I was a bit stiff from sitting on the hard floor for so long. We both loaded up our arms with the vegetables and carried them back into the main room. "The food processors all set up, girls." A young man's voice came around the corner from the far kitchen area. "Okay, Steve," Patty responded. "Don't mind him. On Saturdays he thinks he runs this place." We began to chop up the vegetables in the world's oldest food processor, been set up on a rather beat-up table in what would have been the living room if this was still a house. The poor machine was forever getting jammed. Also, it made so much noise that conversation was impossible. But the radio they turned on was even louder. Altogether, 5 college students were there that day. Steve, Patty, Amy, Sarah, and Meredith. They laughed, sang, danced, and cooked, completely acting like none of them had a care in the world, and I'm sure they didn't. I began to wonder about these kids. They seemed so unconcerned about everything. Life was the here and now, nothing more. Did they ever feel the way I had felt in college, the need to drop out of life? It made me sad to think I was once like them, as young, stupid, and innocent. But weren't stupidity and innocence the same thing? Now that I was a homeless bum chasing an ideal I couldn't name, did that make me any less stupid? No, less innocent, sure. So I guess maybe they weren't the same. But when I thought about it, I was never innocent. My father had taken that from me every time he got drunk and hit me. So no, I was only stupid. It was a given that I was going to continue to be so until I found whatever I was looking for. If I ever did. Which was a kind of big if. No, not kind of. It was a huge if. You know, like if the moon was going to break into a million pieces. Never gonna happen. My life was a wasted mess. When the vegetables were chopped, they were thrown into the 4 immense soup pots. These were waiting on the stoves with stock in them that someone else had made, and then some pasta was added. The music was turned off. Ah, quiet. I was glad for the silence because by that time I'd gotten a pounding headache. From the sugar rush of the doughnuts or the noise? I don't know. It'd be hard to say. Steve pulled chairs out of the back room and we all sat down for a rest. After all the frenzied activities in that building, it had gotten hotter as the morning wore on. Yet we slaved away, working so hard to get lunch ready for the crowd that was sure to come. After all, this was a free meal in a poor neighborhood. Homeless people come out of the woodwork whenever there's free food. Wouldn't you come running if you knew it would be your only meal of the day? I had a feeling that people were already lining up outside, but the windows were too dirty to see out of. Faint blobs of shadows weaving between the grime stains on the glass were all you could see. Could have been people, cars, or bugs. As we sat and waited for the soup to finish, those college kids chatted about everything. From their schoolwork to the weather, no topic was off limits. Several times they tried to bait me into telling my story, but I never did. Why ruin their good time? Besides, I wondered if they'd ever stop to listen to any of the stories of the homeless. The kind of listening when you open up your ears and really try to understand. When you try to feel the other person's pain. When it has touched your life in such a deep way that you'll never be the same. I knew how it had worked out for me, and well, let's just say I shouldn't be wishing that on anyone else. But could that be why they came to this dismal place? To listen? Or were they here to make themselves feel better, having done their good deed for the week? That's why most people volunteer, to make themselves feel superior. Look at me. See what I've done. That's what your puffed out chests seem to say when you get into your fancy cars to drive home to your fancy houses. A little selfishness goes a long way. You make the most of it. We're glad because then we get a meal. But there's a wide gulf between a college experience and homelessness. I wasn't sure they'd understand even if they wanted to. I know even I sometimes couldn't believe what I went through as a homeless person. Well, as a person in general. I'd done so many things I now regretted, but there was no going back on this path I was on. When it was time to serve the soup, one of the girls opened the door. Another pulled the table in front of it. Steve and Philip placed one of the soup pots on the table. The other girls placed disposable bowls, spoons, and loaves of bread there as well. Soon they were scooping up soup into a bowl, placing a slice of bread on top, adding a spoon, and handing it out the door. I glanced into the yard and the street beyond. There was indeed a long line, and I hoped that the 4 large pots would be enough. One small bowl of soup didn't seem like such a good meal. It almost seemed cruel. Yet no one complained. Everyone simply accepted the soup and bread and said thank you. In silence I watched as some sat on the crates in the yard to eat. Others wandered elsewhere, their homes in the neighborhood. Perhaps they had a favorite camping spot nearby, or they were like me and preferred peace and quiet. It didn't matter. There were too many to eat in the yard, and so some had to go elsewhere. When the line was finished, Philip pulled the table away from the door. Closing it behind himself, he went back outside. Steve looked at what was left of the lunch, shaking his head. Sorry, girls, we only get bread today, since there's enough for a bowl for Cindy and nothing more. Shocked that they might have considered eating the food from the kitchen, I looked at them. Most people would have seen it for what it was, garbage. We sat in silence as we ate. I the soup and what turned out to be stale, hard bread. They a half slice of bread each. I don't know how they choked down that bread plain. It was difficult enough with the broth from the soup to soften it up a bit. When we were finished eating, Steve said, Amy has an open space in her apartment. If you want, you can stay with her and work down here. It was clear he was indeed the boss of the kitchen and the leader of this crowd while he was there. Philip had been in and out the whole morning. He trusted Steve to do a good job. Either that or he liked being outside in the fresh air more. Amy was a skinny, mousy redhead who'd said almost nothing the whole morning. She didn't look happy with what Steve was saying. I wondered how much say she'd had in this decision. Or we can help you get a permanent job around here and help you get established on your own. Philip has lots of contacts in the community. Why are you guys so willing to help me? You've only known me a few hours, I said. I wanted Amy to have it out if she was willing to leap on it, and I almost hoped she would. My plan of isolation was usually the best one. Away from people, I couldn't do any harm. Couldn't be harmed. Because we care about what happens to you. We believe God has called us to help those who are down on their luck. Besides, gangs are a real problem, especially in this area, and we don't want anyone to get hurt, Steve answered. Amy stayed silent, looking at the ceiling, her face a blank mask showing nothing. So began my 2-month stay. The space in Amy's apartment was just that, a tiny spot to rest my weary soul. Nothing more than an alcove with a futon, but was a place to sleep. Better than my tent, which had been my original plan. I opted to work in the soup kitchen, so almost every day I was down there. I tried to be at Amy's small apartment as little as possible, since I wasn't exactly a welcome guest in her home. As the saying goes, fish and guests stink after a few days. So when I wasn't working, I was at the library, the park, or an all-night diner, reading a book or people watching. I learned that Philip was a priest, even though he never dressed, talked, or acted like one. The priest from my childhood had been formal in his dress, black slacks, black shirt with a funny white ring under the collar, black dress shoes, white and red robes over it all. When he spoke to my grandmother, he was stiff and cold, making it clear that he was better than us. Other priests I had seen at soup kitchens or shelters were also formal in dress, all in black, minus the robes, and not willing to stoop to the level of speaking to the homeless. At least, not unless it was an absolute necessity. Yet Philip sat with the unwashed masses every day, ate with them, and was as dirty as them. Something about it didn't seem quite right to me. I worked with so much celery while in that kitchen that my hands smelled like celery much of the time. Even after I moved on, the scent lingered and was comforting in an odd sort of way. For days after I left, I would bring my hands to my nose without realizing I was even doing it. to breathe in deep of the scent, to remind myself of the good people in that kitchen, to hear the noise of the food processor, to feel the heat and humidity in the kitchen because the swamp cooler didn't work quite right, to hear the gentle sound of the children laughing as they played in the street, to hear the rough grunts of the guys lounging in the kitchen yard chewing the fat, to see the faces of everyone waiting for their meager lunch. Amazing that one whiff could flood me with all that, like it was some kind of sweet perfume that was a reminder of your first love. Saturdays were for the college kids. On the other 6 days each week it was up to Philip, another priest Andrew, and I to get the soup made. It was hard work but satisfying. No thinking required. Sometimes I'd take big lunches to the shut-ins first thing in the morning. Other days I'd work at a clothes closet at a nearby church late in the afternoon. Simple work of sorting through donations or handing out clothes. Some of those people had only recently gotten out of homelessness, hanging on to their new lives by a thin thread that could break at any moment. It wasn't any way to live. Others were elderly, one tiny step away from losing their homes. When one has to choose between medicine, food, or shelter, what wins? Most were hard-working folks who were one paycheck away from homelessness. You know people like that in your own life. It might be a neighbor, a friend, or a relative, or it might be you. Those are the people that would always be at the bottom of the ladder. The war on poverty is never going to be anything more than a political game, a game played in Washington by people who hadn't ever lived in a shack on the wrong side of town, people who thought being poor was owning only 2 houses, people who'd always think they were superior when they're not. Those are the people that society should have looked down on, not as poor and homeless folk, but until you've lived at the bottom, you'd never understand. Never once was I pushed to get a job beyond those basic tasks. Those were times of enjoyable work because it was so simple. Here's your project for the day. Now go do it. Why couldn't life as a whole be that simple? Why couldn't there be someone out there directing each and every step? Why must we be responsible for our actions? Why must we pay for the mistakes of others? Soup kitchens are my favorite places. For the most part, you find honest people there. Honestly bad or honestly good. There isn't much room for being in between. These poor and homeless masses are the people that have been through the worst life has to offer, yet they've somehow managed to survive, if for only this one more moment. Survival brings out either the best or the worst in people. That raw emotion is hidden beneath the surface, waiting to come alive again. In the microcosm of a soup kitchen, you'll see the result play out each day. The bad ones will steal your last crumb of stale bread, even though they've got a whole gourmet meal in front of them. The good ones will give you their dinner, then the shirt off their back, and finally ask what else they can do for you. I feel at home in soup kitchens, more so than anywhere else I've ever been. I belong without having to do anything, be anything, or act a certain way. I just am when I'm there, and that is good. However, those college kids were another matter. They continued to talk to me, to try to get me to see that they could care about me. They always asked me to go to church with them. I always refused because I knew church resulted in nothing. I never did figure out what their true motive was. Religion doesn't create caring people. It creates people trying to earn their way into the good graces of their imaginary God. Don't you see that too? Thus it had to be something else. After a while it was hard for me to be around them. I was becoming more and more uncomfortable, like wearing a wool sweater that you can't find a way to take off. It itches like crazy, but you're stuck. I knew it wasn't good to have people care about you. In the end, all they would do is cause you pain, more and more pain. Just look at my father. He said he cared and he beat me. My mother said she cared and she ignored me. My grandmother said she cared and she died. My husband said he cared and he left me. No, caring was never good. The thing that finally forced me to leave was Amy giving me earrings because it happened to be Christmas. I knew she was getting too close to seeing who I really was. Not who I showed to the world, not the mask I'd been making prettier and harder as the years progressed, but the real me behind the mask and the walls, and it signaled that it was time to move on. I had no options. I couldn't stay since she was part of the soup kitchen world also. And so with a heavy heart I left that night. I couldn't let my real face show or those walls come down. They were one of the few things in my life that I knew worked, that kept me safe because they kept people at a distance. But I kept those earrings. They've been the only jewelry I've carried beside my watch. Well, until that watch stopped keeping time and I threw it out. You can't keep worthless junk. The earrings looked like autumn leaves, and little did she know how much they represented my heart, dying fast with only the cold ground to look forward to. Well, I don't know. I guess maybe she did. But if she didn't, it was a rather odd gift to give. Shaking my head hard to bring me back to the present, my teeth rattled. I knew I needed to switch stories before I shared too much of my private thoughts with Robert. I'd started to remember things I'd thought were buried too deep to ever be brought up again. That wasn't good. Keep it simple, Cindy. Tell the facts and nothing more. Don't reveal yourself. Don't let him know who you are. Better yet, shut up. Even so, for some stupid reason, I dove into another story before he could even utter a word. Well, soup kitchens aren't the same from one end of the country to the other. In the Southwest they're low-key with soup and bread, maybe breakfast or desserts if you're lucky. Ah, but in the Northeast, now there's the place to go for free food. It's always hot and fresh, and there's plenty for everyone. I had to keep talking. It was like a faucet had been turned on and couldn't be turned off. Since I never felt the need to share anything with anyone, it was an odd feeling. The trick would be to not share too much, to not go too deep, to keep those walls in place, to never show the real me.